They call him by many names. Sometimes they call him Rex Lapis. Others know him as the Geo Archon. And some people can't pronounce his name and call him Zhongli. Hello everyone, welcome to another guide video, and this time around we will take a look at the impenetrable shield, the one and only Zhongli. So let us go over his kit quickly. So his normal attack is a very fast 6-hit multi-hit combo, so there's nothing special there. The animation looks pretty good, but otherwise that's really about it. His elemental skill has 2 options. Tapping it will summon a pillar which pulses and does geo damage to anything nearby. Meanwhile, holding it will give Zhongli interruption resistance and create a geo shield which has 150% effectiveness against all elements, thus making it the strongest type of shield in the game. It also summons a pillar if there is none on the field right now, with the exception of Constellation 1. Enemies near the characters with the Jade Shield up will have their physical and all elemental resistance reduced by 20%. So Zhongli's burst drops a giant meteor, which does damage to anything within an AoE in front of him that petrifies all enemies hit by it, of which it freezes them for 4 seconds, with the exception of bosses. Ascension 1 gives shield strength to the active character every time the shield gets hit, making the shield stronger for whoever is on the field. Meanwhile, his Ascension 4 gives bonus damage to all of Zhongli's abilities based on his max HP. Now let us take a look at his constellations. Constellation 1 allows him to keep 2 pillars on the field, and while it doesn't really change much of his core gameplay, the ability to summon 2 pillars gives more leeway to mess up the pillar's positioning, and it also allows him to keep at least 1 pillar on the field in the event that the other one gets destroyed. On top of that, having access to 2 pillars instead of 1 allows you to reliably maintain the 4-piece tenacity buff. Constellation 2 basically creates a shield whenever his burst is used, and just to clarify, whenever his burst does actually do damage, it does benefit from the resistance shred from his shield. This is especially great for co-op since it allows you to give more survivability to your teammates, and it can also be useful at times for when you need to resummon his shield and your elemental skill is on cooldown. Constellation 3 adds 3 levels to your shield, so it just makes your shield stronger and do a little bit more damage. Constellation 4 increases the meteor's AoE and increases the petrification duration by 2 seconds. This is mostly useful if you play him for a burst DPS kind of build. Constellation 5 adds 3 levels to his meteor, thus giving him more damage. And lastly, Constellation 6 converts the damage taken from his shield into health for the active character. The healing is relatively decent as it frees up a slot for a healer in situations where things like corrosion are at hand. Now, let us move on to the different types of builds that people run for Zhongli. So for the first build, we are going to take a look at the Shieldbot Zhongli. The whole point of this build is to give him as much HP as possible to make his shield impenetrable, because his shield scales off his max HP. Generally, you do want to bring him to level 90 since his shield scales off his max HP, and the difference between level 80 to level 90 is about 1500 HP, which is somewhat significant, especially for HP scaling characters. For talent priorities, you want to prioritize skill over both the normal attack and the burst. So in terms of weapon options for this build, there's only really 2, with the first one being the Black Tassel, a 3-star weapon, which is only used simply because it has a HP percent stat. And the other weapon that people would use in certain situations would be the Favonius Lance if you want to provide some energy to the team, with the caveat of needing to build some crit rate to consistently trigger the passive of the Favonius weapons. Now let's move on to the artifact section. So generally for this build, you want to go for HP percent on Sands, Goblet, and the Circlet. And if you are using Favonius and you don't have enough crit rate, you can run a crit rate Circlet instead. For substats to aim for, you generally want to prioritize HP percent over flat HP, and lastly over crit rate only if you're running Favonius. And for artifact sets that you would like to run, generally the 4-piece tenacity of the Millilith is great because it allows him to give shield strength to the entire party and provide an attack buff every time the elemental skill hits an opponent. The only downside for the effect of this is the difficulty of maintaining the buff's uptime, because his pillar has a very small range and it has to hit an enemy at least every 3 seconds if you want to have a high uptime on the buff. Otherwise, you could also go for a combination of 2 Tenacity and 2 Vorukasha for the 2-piece effect because it buffs his overall HP. So in terms of teams, Generally, because the point of this build is to just have a super tanky shield and the addition of the resistance shred, generally you want to slot him in teams where you don't really feel like dodging because that's the whole point of this build. Personally, I think he's a must-have for any teams with charge attack users or normal attack users such as Yoimiya, Ganyu, or Linny, since any form of interruption to them will result in a big damage loss. Now that that is done, let us move on to the second build. So the second build is the Burst DPS Zhongli. The whole point of this build is to make his meteor do as much damage as humanly possible because big numbers equal good. It's fine to leave him at level 80 because his burst mostly scales off attack with some slight scaling with HP from Ascension 4, but feel free to bring him to level 90 if you feel like it. For talent priorities, you want to prioritize his burst over his skill, and lastly, his normal attack is generally unimportant and can be left at level 1 if you so choose to. Moving on to weapon options, there is actually quite a lot of weapons to choose from. So the Staff of Homa, Hu Tao's weapon, is easily his best in slot due to its high base attack. It also has a crit damage secondary stat along with a passive which increases his HP even further, of which the passive basically gives him more flat attack based on how much max HP he has. Another option would be the Calamity Queller. It is decent for the damage bonus from the passive and the high base attack, however it doesn't really offer anything more than that. The Wavebreaker's Fin is pretty decent at high refinements if you are running a team that has a very high burst cost. The only caveat with this weapon is that it is quite difficult to get because you can only obtain it periodically from the weapon banner. So for the free-to-play options, we also do have the Catch at Refinement 5 if you're into fishing and you have some time to do so. It is relatively accessible because anyone can get it as long as you spend some time into fishing some fishes. The only real downside for this weapon is that it is especially high in demand, especially for characters like Shengling or Raiden. For the Battle Pass, we do have the Deathmatch, and it is only useful for the crit stat and attack buff from the passive, but that's all it really is. The Primordial Jade Wing Spear is not that great despite the crit rate stat because you won't be able to take advantage of the passive because it requires you to consistently do multiple hits to maximize the passive. The same can be said for Zhongli's thematic weapon, the Vortex Vanquisher, because you also need to do the exact same thing as the Jade Wing Spear. The Lithic Spear is pretty decent if you run a team with a few Libre characters to benefit from the passive. Once again, similar to the Wavebreaker's Fin, the only downside is that you can only really get this weapon from the weapon banner at certain times. The Engulfing Lightning has the same situation as the Catch, being that it is also high in demand with other Polearm characters such as Shengling or Raiden. The Blackcliff Pole can be decent if you really don't have any other options. The only downside is that you actually have to wait for the shop to reset and you have to actually use Star Glitter to buy it, of where you could actually have used it for another character or maybe some extra pulls. And lastly, the Favonius Lance is the weakest option. However, with its high base attack, ER substat, and a really good passive, you can actually use it to help Zhongli himself and your entire team gain some extra energy. With that out of the way, let us move on to the artifacts. So generally for the Sans, you can run either an attack Sans or a HP Sans. So a HP Sans will make his shield stronger while trading out for his personal damage, while an attack Sans will increase his overall damage with a little bit of loss for his shield. Generally, just go for whichever piece that has a better substats because the difference of damage between an attack Sans and an HP Sans is relatively marginal. For Goblet, you generally want to go with a Geo damage bonus, and for a Circlet, you generally want to go for whichever crit circlet of which what you are lacking. I personally recommend you to build Zhongli's crit rate all the way to at least 70% to maybe 80% if you want the Meteor to do consistently big damage. And in terms of which substats to prioritize, you want to have at least enough ER so that you are able to burst maybe every rotation, depending on your preference, over stats like crit, attack percent, or HP percent. If you want to know the exact value for how much ER you need to burst every rotation or every other rotation, I'll attach a link down below to Keqing Main's site, specifically their Zhongli guide, so if you're interested, go check that out. But personally, I recommend testing whatever artifacts you have with whatever teams that you intend to run and see if you will have enough energy to do what you intend to do, whether that be bursting every rotation or maybe every other rotation. For artifact sets, the 4 Noblesse Oblige is very good because he can benefit from the attack buff from the 4-piece effect, and you can also buff the entire team's attack along with it. Another good set would be the 4 Emblem of Severed Fate if you have very high ER for Zhongli. The only downside is that it is a relatively competitive set and very high in demand with other units in the game. In certain situations, 4-piece Archaic Petra can be used if you want to buff a mono elemental team or maybe buff a specific character. The only caveat is that Zhongli himself needs to pick up the shard in order to activate the effect. Or alternatively, you could mix the 2-piece effects from these different sets based on whichever ones you have better substats on. For example, you could do the 2 Petra or 2 Noblesse, or maybe you could mix double emblem with double Petra, Gladiator, Noblesse if you do want a little bit of energy recharge. Or you could do this combination of quad attack. And when I use the term quad attack on this channel, I generally refer to a mix of 2 Gladiator with 2 Shimenawa, or maybe you could count like the 2 Vermilion and the 2 Echoes of an Offering artifact. And lastly, the damage will be inferior, but you could go for either a DPS build with 4 Tenacity, or you could do a mix of 2 Tenacity, 2 Vorukaja in order to trade some personal damage for a slightly stronger shield. And now lastly, let us move on to the teams that you can run. So generally, there isn't much options for running a burst DPS Zhongli, the first one being Hyper Zhongli with Goro, a Flex Geo slot, and Bennett. Goro is there to provide a Geo damage buff from his elemental skill, while Bennett is there for the attack buff. As for the Flex Geo slot, you can choose either one of these. Ningguang is pretty decent because she's able to offer a little bit more damage to the team, and with her Ascension 4, you can let your Zhongli walk past her Jade screen in order to provide 12% Geo damage bonus. Alternatively, you could also do with Geo Traveler, which I would argue is his best teammate in this situation, because not only does he generate a lot of energy to be a great battery for Geo characters, he does do decent damage if he is built, and he does create constructs with his abilities, which allows you to maximize the resonance damage from Zhongli's pillar. The only downside of running him is that you have to know where and how to position your abilities so that you can maximize the resonance damage, and you have to get used to accidentally climbing the barrels or Zhongli's pillars or getting stuck in certain situations, which I would argue is the only downside for running Geo Traveler. And lastly, you could also use Albedo because it offers a bit of an extra damage, and his flower is also considered a construct, so you can get some minor damage from the resonance. So another alternate team for a Hyper Burst Zhongli, but a more premium version, is with Raiden, Yelan, and Bennett. So I found this team a long time ago, and surprisingly, with the amount of buffs that everyone is able to provide to each other, it has a very dynamic interaction. So Raiden provides burst damage bonus from her elemental skill and reduces Zhongli's energy requirement by serving as a battery with her elemental burst. Meanwhile, Yelan adds some extra damage to the team, and she does provide a damage bonus to the active character from her Ascension 4 as long as her burst is up. You can also run a burst-centric Zhongli in other teams, but it will tank his personal damage by quite a lot, but feel free to do so if you feel like it. And lastly, we move on to the final build. So the community call this PikeLi, aka Physical Zhongli. This build is for the most dedicated Zhongli enjoyers who wants to bask in the glory of his normal attack animation. I mean, just look at that. You want to bring him to level 90 to maximize his damage bonus from his Ascension 4. And for talent priorities, you want to give normal attack and the elemental skill just the same amount of priority over the elemental burst, because his shield does provide the minus 20% resistance shred to all elements and physical, so it shouldn't be neglected. On top of that, if you're running this build, very likely your shield is going to be more paper thin than a Shieldbot Zhongli, so you do want it to be as strong as it can be. For the weapon options, as the name of this build implies, Crescent Pike is his go-to weapon for this build, simply because Zhongli's normal attacks are very fast and capable of multi-hits, and it allows him to reliably trigger the passive of the weapon. It is also more accessible, being a craftable weapon, thus making it easy to not only obtain it, you can also max out its refinement level if you have enough polearm billets. Note that the Pike's passive is affected by physical damage bonus of the character, which makes it better than most other options. Another good weapon generally, just like all the other builds, is also Staff of Homa, as the passive and the crit damage stat will help boost his personal damage. The Primordial Jade Wing Spear this time around is actually a decent option with the crit rate stat, because this playstyle with his normal attacks allows Zhongli to build up stacks on his passive and fully take advantage of it. Deathmatch is also pretty good for its crit rate stat and passive despite the low base attack. If you really do not have any of these options, you could run the 3-star weapon, a Refinement 5 White Tassel, if you are running Yunjin in this team. So now let us move on to the artifacts. So for artifacts, generally you want to go with an attack sense. Once again, you could probably go for HP sense, but depending on which one has a better substat, I think an attack percent sense is probably better this time around. For the goblet, you want to go with a physical damage bonus goblet. Once again, for the circlet, just go for whichever crit that you are lacking. For the substat priority, you want to prioritize crit rate over attack over everything else. For the artifact sets, we have the 4-piece Pale Flame. If you are able to maintain debuffs uptime with his elemental skill, especially if you have Constellation 1. Otherwise, you can also run a combination of the 2-piece Pale Flame and the 2-piece Bloodstained Chivalry for the physical damage bonus effect. Alternatively, you could also run the 4-piece Gladiator's Finale because it also buffs his normal attack damage. However, it cannot buff Crescent Spike passive, which is probably the only downside of this set. You could also run the 4-piece Echoes of an Offering, but it does have some caveats. You can read that up somewhere on the internet or maybe check out Kaching Mains, there'll be a link down below once again. But to summarize it, TLDR, it has some issues with the effect's ability to trigger in relation to the ping of the game and the frame rate of the game. So I generally wouldn't recommend running 4 Echoes unless you happen to have a really good 4-piece set lying around. And lastly, if you do not have any of these options, you want to go mix of every 2-piece of whichever substats you have. Maybe double Pale Flame with double Gladiator, double Bloodstain with double Shimenawa, or mix of Gladiator and Shimenawa. As long as you have really good substats, it should be fine. And finally, we have the teams. So there are 2 main teams that I saw from Kaching Main's side. The first one being a driver Zhongli, of which you pair him up with Beidou, Fischl, and with Xingqiu or Yelan. So generally in this team, Zhongli helps drive the team with his elemental shield, which provides the resistance shred, and additively with his physical damage. It is relatively strong if you don't intend to run a hyper carry physical Zhongli. While the other team, of which you can run this, is the hyper carry version, where you pair Zhongli up with Yunjin, Fischl, and Rosaria. This team helps drive his damage with the Super Conduct on top of some non-negligible damage from Rosaria and Fischl. If you do have Constellation 6 for Rosaria, the physical resistance shred that she offers from that is extremely helpful for Zhongli's damage if you do have it. So to summarize the entire thing, overall Zhongli is a really good option for those who wants a comfy and stress-free gameplay. Unless you're somehow a Yoimiya, Ganyu, or Linear main who doesn't like getting interrupted while doing what you do, Zhongli is a must in some of these situations. As usual, leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content, and if you have any questions, any feedback, or you want to just say whatever you want to say, leave a comment down below. And that is it for this video. I wish you guys the best of luck in your summons while the banner is still up right now, and I hope you all have a great day. Peace out.